In 1945, in a small kitchen in Alabama or Mississippi, a 15-cent piece of pork fatback began to melt in a black cast-iron skillet. The fat sizzled softly. Thin smoke curled beneath the yellow light, carrying a warm, salty aroma, while cornmeal waited in an enamel bowl and an old wooden recipe box sat slightly open beside the stove. To her, that piece of fatback was frying oil, the smoky flavor in a pot of greens, crispy cracklings mixed into cornbread, and the aroma that called the whole family back to the table. She called it knowing how to cook. This story is about skill, dignity, and family memory. She knew how to draw flavor from the bottom of a pan, save the pot liquor after hours of simmering, soften bones over low heat, and stretch a scarce ingredient beyond a single meal. She knew how to preserve what others overlooked. In the 25 dishes ahead, you may recognize an aroma, a plate, or a Sunday dinner that once appeared in your own home. If that kitchen reminds you of someone who once cooked for you, subscribe to the channel. Tonight, the recipe box opens, beginning with number 25, crackling cornbread, cast iron, pork fat, and cornmeal. Before recipes were printed on the backs of boxes of pre-mixed flour, Grandma had her own sign that dinner was about to begin. It was the moment a piece of pork fat touched the bottom of the cast iron skillet, releasing a deep, steady sizzle through the small kitchen. The salty, smoky aroma slipped through the cracks around the door, clung to the fabric curtains, and called the children playing in the yard back inside. Yellow cornmeal waited in a chipped enamel bowl. Freshly picked green tomatoes still left the scent of plant sap on her fingertips. With only a few simple ingredients, she filled the kitchen with sound, warmth, and a meal worth waiting for. Dish number 25, crackling cornbread. Pork fatback slowly heated in the black cast iron skillet, then began to sing with tiny crackling sounds. The pieces of crackling shrank, their edges turning golden brown, smoky, fragrant, and salty. In 1945, in the kitchens of sharecropper families across the Black Belt of Alabama and Mississippi, a pound of pork fatback cost about 15 cents. Cornmeal was cheaper, at only around 4 to 5 cents a pound, but Grandma never saw either of them as things of little value. She rendered the fat very slowly, keeping the clear drippings at the bottom of the skillet before using a wooden spoon to scoop out the cracklings. The crisp pieces were mixed into the cornmeal, carrying with them the saltiness and smoky flavor of meat that had already served another purpose. She poured the mixture into the still hot skillet and listened to the distinct sound of the batter hitting the fat, then placed the skillet in the oven. The edges of the cornbread gradually darkened until they were nearly burned, while the center remained soft and richly flavored. From one inexpensive piece of fatback, she obtained cooking grease, flavor, energy, and a loaf of cornbread large enough to place at the center of the table. In her hands, even the smallest portion could stretch beyond a single meal. Even lard knew how to tell a story. Dish number 24. Country-style, skillet corn, Cack's thin cornmeal batter dripped from the end of a spoon, struck the hot surface of the skillet, and sizzled in the bacon grease left over from the previous meal. Small rings of bubbles raced around the edges of each cake. The rims gradually dried, turned golden, and became thin and crisp like lace. In 1932, in the kitchens of field laborers in North Carolina and South Carolina, a cup of cornmeal cost only about 3 to 4 cents. All that was added was water, a pinch of salt, and a little grease still resting in the skillet. A meal began with so little, yet Grandma's hands gave it a rhythm of its own. She mixed the cornmeal with water until the batter was just thin enough, seasoned it with salt, and spooned individual portions into the skillet. With movements made familiar by years spent at the stove, she spread the batter into thin cakes. She waited until the edges had set before flipping each one quickly, allowing the underside to become golden and crisp while the center remained slightly soft and moist. Those cakes carried memories of the fields, mornings that began before sunrise, and meals that had to provide strength for a long day. 3 ingredients, a hot iron surface, and a pair of skilled hands created an entire way of life. Dish number 20, fried green tomatoes. Slices of green tomato rested on the wooden cutting board, firm-fleshed, cool to the touch, and faintly tart. When placed in hot oil, the cornmeal coating immediately began to bubble, gradually changing from pale yellow to the color of honey. In 1933, on farms in Alabama and Georgia, green tomatoes picked from the garden cost almost nothing, or sold for about 2 cents a pound. Cornmeal cost around 5 cents a pound, while a quart of buttermilk cost about 10 cents. Grandma picked the tomatoes before they had time to turn red, cut them into thick slices, and dipped each piece in buttermilk. She then coated them in seasoned cornmeal and lowered them into the skillet in small batches. The sound of boiling oil raced around the edges of each tomato slice, crisp and quick like summer rain striking a tin roof. She turned each piece at exactly the right moment, keeping the outside hot and crisp while the inside remained soft and tart. In that kitchen, even something that had not yet ripened could still find a place at the table. The tomatoes were not red yet, but the skillet was already hot. Even the unripe could become a meal. When the final sizzle faded, one thing Grandma always saved remained in the kitchen. It rested at the bottom of the pot of greens, carrying a greenish-brown color, a salty, smoky flavor, and the warmth of many hours spent waiting. From that broth, another supper was about to begin. Pot liquor, greens, and the bean pot. After the sizzle of cornmeal and pork fat, the kitchen slowed beside a deep pot. She understood that the most valuable part was sometimes found where few people thought to look. After hours of simmering, the liquid at the bottom of the pot had absorbed the salt, the smoke, a little meat fat, and the dark green color of the leaves. She tilted the spoon, tasted a sip, then lowered the heat. That liquid was enough to begin another meal, because anything that could still nourish someone was always saved. Dish number 20. Whoa. Collard green pot liquor. Beneath the limp, tender collard greens, the greenish-brown liquid rested quietly, giving off warmth. The aroma of smoked ham hock blended with the deep flavor of the greens like a trace left behind by an afternoon of slow cooking. In 1935, on African-American farms in Georgia and Alabama, a bunch of collard greens cost about 8 to 10 cents, while a piece of smoked ham hock cost about 15 to 20 cents. She simmered them together until the leaves were tender and the smoky flavor had soaked deep into the liquid. When the pot of greens was ready, she ladled the liquid into a bowl and placed it beside warm cornbread. The rising steam carried the scent of greens, smoked meat, and the faint sweetness that remained after hours on the stove. Some days, she saved that liquid to make soup, use as the base for a pot of beans, or stir into brown gravy for the next meal. Others might have seen it as leftovers, but she knew that flavor, nourishment, usefulness, and memory remained at the bottom of the pot. She saved every spoonful as though preserving an ingredient that time had made deeper and richer. There was still supper at the bottom of the pot. Dish number 21. Collard greens simmered with smoked ham hock. The steady sound of running water in the sink marked the beginning of this dish. She submerged each bunch of collard greens, lifted the leaves, gently rubbed along their folds, then changed the water. 3 times, sometimes 4, until the bottom of the basin was completely free of grit. In 1952, in family kitchens across the Carolinas, Georgia, and Virginia, a bunch of collard greens cost about 10 cents, while a smoked ham hock usually cost around 20 cents. She stripped the leaves away from the tough stems, rolled them into bundles, then sliced them into even ribbons. The knife striking the cutting board created a dry, steady rhythm. The greens went into the pot with the ham hock, gradually sinking into the steam, then simmering over low heat until the leaves became soft and tender, and the liquid beneath them took on a salty, smoky flavor. This dish required hard-working hands, eyes that knew how to read the flame, and someone willing to wait. A hurried cook could make the greens tender, but would struggle to draw out the deep flavor hidden within every layer of the leaves. The greens were cleaned through patience. Dish number 20, beans, simmered with smoked ham hock. On a cold afternoon, steam clouded the window panes as a pot of white beans began to simmer gently. The smoke from the ham hock blended with the warm, starchy aroma, while a wooden spoon dragged across the bottom of the pot with a low, muffled sound. In 1948, in African-American working-class kitchens in Memphis, St. Louis, and rural Arkansas, dried white beans cost about 10 cents per pound, while a smoked ham hock cost around 20 cents apiece. She had soaked the beans the night before. In the morning, she placed the ham hock in the pot, added water, and let everything simmer. Over the course of many hours, the beans split open and became creamy. The liquid gradually thickened, and the smoked meat began to pull away from the bone. She stirred very gently so the beans would keep their shape, then lowered the heat and allowed the pot to continue simmering. That small ham hock flavored the entire pot, turning dried beans into a dish that could wait for the family to come home and last through several meals. One small bone fed them for 3 days. As the lid was placed back on the pot, the story turned toward ingredients that were less pleasing to the eye. At the far end of the butcher counter, she saw bones, organ meats, oxtails, and the parts others passed over. In her eyes, they were already broth, gravy, holidays, and a meal served with dignity, the cuts of meat others left behind. At the far end of the meat counter, there were often brown paper packages that few people stopped to examine. Inside were neck bones, oxtails, chitterlings, giblets, and other cuts that needed many hours before they would become tender. Their prices were low because most shoppers dreaded the cleaning, the smell that lingered on their hands, and the thought of keeping a pot on the stove all day. Grandma looked at those packages differently. She saw broth that could be poured over rice, gravy for holiday meals, and a dinner made with time and skill. Dish number 19. Spice-stewed chitterlings. When the pot of chitterlings began to boil, the smell of vinegar, onions, and dried red pepper drifted across the backyard. The entire neighborhood knew that a holiday dish was being prepared. In 1943, in Memphis, Birmingham, and the Mississippi Delta, chitterlings cost only about 3 to 5 cents a pound. A 10-pound bucket cost around 30 to 50 cents, but the real price was paid in the many hours of labor spent beside the sink. Grandma rolled up her sleeves and washed each piece under cold running water, turned it inside out, scraped it clean, and rinsed it again and again. The sound of running water blended with the clatter of the metal basin against the sides of the sink. Once everything was clean, she placed the chitterlings in a pot with onions, vinegar, red pepper, and seasonings, then simmered them until the meat was tender and the aroma became warmer and milder. The younger generation learned this dish by standing beside her, watching every movement, and then repeating each step themselves. Patience was passed from one pair of hands to another. Patience had a scent of its own. Dish number 18, pork neck, bones stewed with rice. The pieces of neck bone rested close together in an enamel pot, with only thin strips of meat clinging to them. As the water began to heat, onions and garlic rose to the surface, carrying an aroma far richer than the ingredients appeared capable of producing. In 1958, in African-American working-class kitchens, from Mississippi to Chicago, pork neck bones cost about 30 cents a pound, while rice cost around 10 to 12 cents a pound. Grandma added a little vinegar and let the pot simmer. Over the course of several hours, the collagen in the bones dissolved into the liquid, gradually thickening the broth. The lid trembled gently with each pulse of the simmer. At mealtime, she spooned white rice onto a plate, ladled the glossy broth over it, and placed a few pieces of bone alongside. The children used their forks to pull away every small strand of meat, patiently searching through the crevices of the bones. Even the small amount of meat filled the entire plate of rice with the aroma of onions, garlic, and rich broth. The bones were cheap, but the gravy was rich. Dish number 17. Stewed oxtails. The cut sides of the oxtails turned deep brown when they touched the bottom of the hot pot. The sound of the meat searing was brief and firm, leaving a layer of brown bits stuck to the bottom. In 1962, in Harlem, Detroit, and Philadelphia, oxtails sold for about 40 cents a pound. A can of tomatoes cost around 10 cents, and butter beans also cost about 10 cents a pound. Grandma browned each round of oxtail, turning it evenly until the surface of the meat had seared. Onions, tomatoes, and butter beans were added afterward. The stew remained over low heat for many hours until the tomatoes dissolved into the liquid, the beans softened, and the meat fell away from the bone on its own. By then, the broth was glossy brown, thick, and deeply aromatic. Oxtails later became an expensive ingredient. Even so, the earliest memory of the dish remained in kitchens that understood low heat and knew how to wait. What had once been left behind earned its place on the table through skill. Dish number 16. Poultry giblet. Gravy. In a small bowl beside the roasting pan, Grandma saved the neck, heart, liver, and gizzard from the chicken or turkey. In 1955, in holiday kitchens in Atlanta, Richmond, and Detroit, these parts usually came with the whole bird. Flour cost only about 5 cents a pound, while the onion used for flavoring cost around 3 cents. Grandma simmered the giblets in seasoned water until they were tender, removed them, and chopped them into small pieces. The brown drippings that had collected in the roasting pan were poured into a skillet. She stirred in the giblets, sprinkled in flour, and continued stirring until the gravy thickened, becoming rich, smooth, and deeply flavored. The wooden spoon left a slow brown trail as it moved across the bottom of the skillet, and the gravy gradually closed over it. The holiday meal became complete because the cook had remembered every small part. In that skillet, skill and memory worked together to thicken the gravy. From those packages of meat at the far end of the counter, the recipes began to travel beyond the kitchens where they had first been made. They traveled by train, inside suitcases tied with rope, through church gatherings, and with families leaving the South. In Chicago, Detroit, the Low Country, and the Mississippi Delta, the dishes continued to live in new kitchens, the community calendar. Among the stack of yellowed paper cards in the recipe box were dishes remembered by dates rather than addresses. New Year's Day was reserved for a pot of black-eyed peas. Monday was for red beans and rice. A few other cards carried traces of long roads, where performers remembered a restaurant by the smell of fried chicken before they even had a chance to see the sign out front. In Grandma's kitchen, every dish had its own time. The calendar hanging on the wall, the washtub in the yard, and the schedule of a touring company could all determine what would be placed on the stove. Food followed the rhythm of life, helping people preserve their strength, hold on to hope, and find one another through the long days. Dish number 12. Black-eyed peas with rice. On the morning of New Year's Day, the lid of the pot trembled gently over a low flame. The black-eyed peas soaked the night before began to soften, while the pot of rice beside them released the warm scent of starch. On the table, leafy greens and cornbread had already been prepared like the first blessings of the new year. In 1950, in Charleston and Savannah, a pound of black-eyed peas cost about 8 to 10 cents. Rice usually cost around 10 to 12 cents a pound, while a smoked ham hock cost about 20 cents. Grandma placed the ham hock in the pot with the peas, added water, and let everything simmer. The smoky flavor gradually soaked into each pea, making the liquid which had been clear at first, richer and thicker. When the peas were just tender, she mixed some of them with the hot rice and served them at the table with the greens and cornbread. The sound of spoons touching the sides of bowls rang out among the New Year's wishes. Each pea carried a small hope for good fortune, abundance, and peaceful days ahead. A simple dish became a family ritual because it was repeated on the same day across many generations. The year began with beans. Dish number 11, red beans and rice Monday in New Orleans, had a different rhythm. Outside, clothes were scrubbed, wrung out, and hung on the line. In the kitchen, the pot of red beans simmered quietly, slowly enough that the cook could turn to other work while still hearing the soft pop of bubbles beneath the lid. In 1955, in African American Creole kitchens, red beans cost about 10 to 12 cents a pound. Rice cost around 12 cents, while smoked sausage cost about 25 to 35 cents. On Sunday night, Grandma had already soaked the beans in a large bowl. The next morning, the beans were poured into a pot with a ham bone or sausage, followed by onions, celery, and bell peppers. The aroma of the vegetables gradually blended with the smoky scent of the meat. From time to time, Grandma returned to the kitchen, lifted the lid, stirred the pot once, and then carried the laundry basket back out to the yard. Over several hours, some of the beans broke apart, thickening the broth until it became creamy. By the end of the day, white rice was spooned into bowls and covered with red beans, carrying the smoky flavor and heat that had been building since morning. The dish worked alongside the woman of the house. While her hands were busy with wash water and wet fabric, time and the low flame quietly completed the rest of the work. Time taught the beans to speak. Dish number 10. Free chicken. On the black performers touring circuit along southern roads, performers often remembered a stopping place through their senses. Sometimes it was the yellow light beside the porch. Sometimes it was the smell of black pepper, seasoned brine, and chicken skin changing color in hot oil. After many hours in the car, that aroma signaled that somewhere ahead was a kitchen willing to welcome the weary. In 1955, at African American roadside restaurants in Memphis, Atlanta, and other stops during the era of racial segregation, chicken cost about 45 to 55 cents a pound. The salt and seasonings used for the brine cost only about 3 to 5 cents, but the flavor needed an entire night to develop. The chicken was soaked the day before, allowing the salt and seasonings to penetrate deep into the meat, nearly to the bone. When the guests were about to arrive, the cook lifted out each piece, let it drain, and lowered it into the oil. The sound of frying rose powerfully, the skin gradually darkened and became deeply crisp, while the meat inside remained tender and richly seasoned. For performers who had to travel along unsafe roads, a plate of hot chicken meant more than a meal. It marked a place with clean tables and chairs, people ready to welcome them, and a few minutes to rest. The long road remembered the smell of chicken. After the dishes that followed dates and journeys, the story returned to the family table. There, pork chops waited to become tender beneath the lid of a pot. Chicken had been seasoned the night before, and a tray of macaroni and cheese stood at the center of the table like a complete and satisfying dinner. Sweets from the garden, the hedgerow, and summer. After trays of food rich with the aromas of meat, cheese, and gravy, the kitchen gradually settled into a gentler rhythm. In those days, sweetness often began with whatever was already available around the house. A sweet potato resting beneath warm ashes, a basket of peaches softening quickly in the July sun, a small bucket filled with wild blackberries, with leaves and dried thorns still caught around the handle. The children stood near the oven, peering through the glowing red opening, listening to the fruit juices bubble gently and waiting for the first spoonful to be brought out. Each dessert preserved a season, an afternoon, and a few sugar-sticky fingerprints. Dish number 6, sweet potato pie. The sweet potatoes remained in the oven until their skins wrinkled and the flesh inside became soft, releasing a mild caramel aroma. When Grandma split one open, the rising heat carried the warm, earthy sweetness into the air, blending with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg waiting on the table. In 1946, in holiday kitchens across Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas, sweet potatoes cost about 3 to 5 cents a pound. An egg cost around 5 to 6 cents, while sugar cost about 6 cents a pound. Those few small coins were enough to make the pie everyone looked forward to seeing on the holiday table. Grandma used a spoon to scrape the sweet potato flesh into a bowl, then mashed it until completely smooth with butter, sugar, eggs, and spices. The spoon made a soft scraping sound as it pressed against the sides of the bowl, while the mixture gradually turned a glossy orange. She poured the filling into a homemade pie crust, smoothed the surface, and placed it in the oven. Through the cloudy oven glass, the surface of the pie slowly began to set. The aroma of sweet potatoes, butter, and spices filled the room, letting even those standing in the hallway know that dessert would soon be served. Before pumpkin pie appeared on many holiday tables, sweet potato pie had already held that place in the memories of many African-American Southern families. Inexpensive sweet potatoes held their place on the holiday table. Dish number 5, country-style peach cobbler. Summer peaches ripened so quickly that their skins softened right in the basket beside the window. When Grandma cut them in half, clear peach juice ran down her wrist, leaving behind the sweet, slightly tart fragrance of fruit that had reached perfect ripeness. In 1944, in Georgia and Alabama, peaches in season cost about 5 cents a pound. Flour also cost around 5 cents a pound, while sugar cost about 6 cents. Grandma sliced the peaches into thick pieces and arranged them in a deep, buttered baking dish. In another bowl, she mixed flour, sugar, milk, and butter into a smooth batter. She poured the batter over the fruit, allowing it to flow into the spaces between the peach slices. As the dish heated, the batter rose around the fruit, while the peach juices turned into a glossy golden syrup. A soft bubbling sound came from the edges of the dish inside the oven, as though summer were speaking in a very quiet voice. Grandma waited until the batter had turned golden on top before taking the cobbler out. The aroma of hot peaches immediately swept through the kitchen, carrying memories of seasons when all the fruit ripened at once and had to be used before it became too soft. Summer rested in a deep dish. Dish number 4, wild blackberry dumplings. An afternoon spent picking blackberries often left thin scratches on the arms and deep purple stains on the fingertips. The children carried buckets of berries home, eating the ripest ones as they walked and leaving a few drops of blackberry juice on their collars. In 1936, along the hedgerows of the Carolina Piedmont and throughout the rural South, wild blackberries could be picked for free. Flour cost about 5 cents a pound, while sugar cost around 6 cents. A dessert could therefore begin with an entire afternoon of walking, bending beneath thorny bushes, and searching for clusters of berries that had turned deep purple. Grandma poured the blackberries into a pot, added sugar, and cooked them until the fruit burst and the juice became a purple so dark it was nearly black. She dropped spoonfuls of soft dough onto the surface, then covered the pot so the steam could make them rise into light, rounded dumplings. When the lid was lifted, the rich, warm aroma of cooked blackberries rose from the pot. The fruit juices surrounded the soft dumplings, staining the spoon and the corners of the children's mouths purple. The ingredients cost almost nothing, but the dish preserved the entire afternoon of berry picking, the thorn scratches on their hands, and the feeling of standing beside the pot and waiting. Free, but never meaningless. Those desserts would later appear after large meals. On the holiday table, they stood beside greens, fried chicken, and macaroni and cheese, surrounded by chairs that had been pulled out before the sound of the church bells had fully faded. 25 dishes have passed through the cast iron skillet, the bottom of the pot of greens, neck bones, giblets, dried beans, sweet potatoes, summer peaches, and wild berries growing along the hedgerows. In Grandma's hands, every small portion found a place at the table, becoming dinner, a holiday meal, and a family memory. The recipe box remained beside the stove. The yellowed cards still carried the smell of lard and baked cheese, along with dried streaks of vegetable broth around their edges. Grandma knew how to save what others overlooked, then turn patience into warm food for the entire family. Those dishes disappear when no one is left to ask how to wash the greens, how much vinegar to add to the pot of chitterlings, or why the banana dish must rest overnight. Memory needs someone to write it down, cook it again, and continue telling the story. If this story reminds you of an old kitchen, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment sharing a dish your grandmother used to make.